Welcome to this episode of the WorkXO Culture Chat podcast, where we explore the intersection of workplace culture and the future of work. We feature progressive leaders who intentionally manage their cultures so that you might also experience the power of doing the same. Thanks for listening and enjoy.
Hello, everybody. This is Charlie Judy, founder and CEO of WorkXO. We have a culture management platform called the Workplace Genome. We'd love for you to check it out. Thanks for joining us for another edition of the Culture Chat podcast. Really psyched to have Joe Gerstein with us today. Joe is a thought leader, a keynote speaker, a consultant advisor, really just sage in this world of inclusiveness, how important it is to what we do every day, and certainly turning it into a competitive advantage, which I know I feel strongly about. Joe's going to talk to us today about really how do we go beyond paying lip service to this thing we call inclusion and turning it into something that's meaningful, it's tangible, that's actionable. And that's something that we know organizations struggle with all the time. He's going to talk about how do we even define and understand inclusion? How do we use some common, authentic language around it? How do we measure outcomes and make sure that we're reinforcing and clarifying inclusion as an important part of our business with actions and decisions and behaviors? And then what does it really look like? How do we know that it's happening? How do we know that we're turning it into or using it as a competitive advantage? So really glad to have Joe with us today. I'm not going to introduce him. I'm going to let him do that. Joe, thanks for being here.
You bet. Cool. Thanks for having me. I'm excited to catch up with you and to be a part of this conversation. So my name is Joe Gerstein, and I do diversity and inclusion work. And I've been doing this work for about 15 years now. I did it first as an internal practitioner. My last, real job was working for a regional healthcare organization, a healthcare provider, and I led their efforts around workforce diversity, having an inclusive organizational culture, and delivering culturally competent care. But for the past 10, almost 11 years, I've done this work externally, and so I today work with organizations and teams and leaders and help them find some new clarity around this set of issues and put some new practices in place. And I think one of the things that is still kind of commonly overlooked in this conversation, and there's a lot of parts of this conversation. Diversity inclusion is a big set of things. There's a lot of conversations, but I think one of the kind of consistent parts of my message is that part of what we're struggling against is that this stuff is still poorly understood, oftentimes misunderstood. And the example that I will often use is even in organizations that speak loudly and proudly about diversity and inclusion, that speak loudly and proudly about their commitment. If I walk up to 10 leaders at random and ask them what diversity is, what inclusion is, why those things are valuable, and how we capture that value as an organization, I will probably hear 10 different answers, and 7 or 8 of them won't even make any sense. They'll just be this kind of rambling collection of really nice, warm, fuzzy words. And so I think, bringing greater clarity to what the work is a really important part of it. And I think that lack of clarity is one of the reasons why so many organizations have a hard time figuring out what to do and what to measure. They do have good intentions, but because they're chasing this vague, abstract idea, they're not sure how to get there. But I've never, for better or worse, I've never really focused on a particular kind or size of organization. So I've worked with organizations, probably every kind of organization, across geography, across size. Most of the organizations that I work with are probably medium to large corporate clients, but I've also worked with nonprofit folks and government folks and churches and communities, and so I get to do this work in a lot of different settings.
You're doing awesome work, and you're already calling us out, which is great, and I hope that's where this conversation continues. I remember sitting in a room with you, or a room with you and 200 other people at a HR conference. I think it was down in Atlanta years ago, and you said something very simple that for me kind of opened my mind and changed the way that I think about this. and I'm maybe paraphrasing here, but it was every time you have two people in the room, diversity is present. And this notion that we must go deeper than what is on the surface as we define it and as we understand what it means to be included and to have a sense of affiliation and ownership and belonging is really powerful. And so I hope that we'll touch on that a little bit more. So here's the one big question, and I'm going to throw that out, and then let's see where this conversation goes. I mean, you've alluded to it. You've teed it up for us. We again, collectively, the world of work, pay such lip service. Heck, not even the world of work, right? I mean, just the world in general pays such lip service to this idea of inclusiveness. And really, there's no better time, certainly in the world of America today, to talk about this subject. How do we know, when does it go deeper than lip service? How do we know that commitment, that appreciation, that dedication and investment in creating an inclusive employee experience is real, and that it's showing up in a very authentic way, and that, to put it simply, we're walking the talk around that we're putting our money where our mouth is? I know that's a really loaded question, but I'd love for people to leave this call with some signs or some signals or some things that they know that they can look out for or strive towards as they try to create those inclusive employee experiences.
Yeah, well, that's a great question, and it's a big question, and I'll probably give a very sloppy, rambling collection of answers to it. But I do think there's a big disconnect there. If you spend time like I do looking at corporate websites and annual reports, specifically regarding what they say about diversity and inclusion, they say incredible things. You would think that for a lot of these companies, diversity and inclusion are the most important things in the world. The problem is, and I'm not saying the companies are necessarily being disingenuous. I'm not saying that there's not good intentions behind those words and those statements and those proclamations, but again, because they don't understand it on a fundamental level, almost none of that stuff shows up in actions and choices and behaviors. If diversity and inclusion are incredibly important to you as an organization, and you get to decide that. I think that they should be. I think that there's a good case that they should be very important to you. But if you say publicly that they are very important, that they are strategic imperatives, that they are cultural values, that they are guiding principles, then those things should show up in your decisions and in your behaviors on a regular basis. I go into a lot of corporate organizations that say big, beautiful things about diversity and inclusion to do diversity and inclusion workshops, and I'm greeted by a conference room full of people that don't want me to be there and don't want to be there themselves, right? So what I'm seeing is that the company is saying diversity and inclusion are really, really valuable, but they're not hiring and promoting and retaining people that are willing and able to align with that value. I would say that most organizations that say these wonderful things about diversity and inclusion are still better at hiring and promoting people that do not agree with that than they are at hiring and promoting people that are diverse and inclusive. If we care about this stuff, is it written into every single job description? Do we ask people in interviews questions about diversity and inclusion? Do we evaluate them on diversity and inclusion competencies? Those are some simple things to look for right there, and you'll find them almost nowhere. Do we have no disparity or small disparities in outcomes? Most organizations still have huge disparities in their engagement rates, in their promotion rates. I was on, there's a lot of conversation today in and outside of the workplace about sexual harassment for very good reason. Right. I was on a panel yesterday morning with a group of corporate lawyers talking about this issue, and it's a group of women corporate lawyers. And one of the things that they kept talking about was it was shocking to them when their male colleagues were shocked by these stories, because they hear these things and talk about these things and experience these things all the time. They're having a very different experience in the workplace than their male colleagues, right?
Right.
That's part of what we're trying to get to. And I think a lot of people don't realize that that's the case. We're having different experiences. Women and people of color and other folks are leaving the workforce for reasons that white men aren't leaving the workforce for. We're having very different experiences because we continue to treat and evaluate and judge each other differently, whether there's bad intentions behind that or not, and there's probably some of both, but that still continues to happen. And I think, there's some very non-touchy-feely, performance-specific, ethics, safety-specific things that we can look at as well. I think on a very fundamental level, what inclusion is about creating spaces and places where people who are naturally different from each other can tell the truth to each other. And when I go into workplaces, even workplaces that say big, beautiful things about honest conversation and speaking directly to each other, I find employees that have experiences where they weren't comfortable telling the truth to someone, right? They weren't comfortable disagreeing with their supervisor. They weren't comfortable raising an issue. So I see that as being very core to inclusion work, but it also has other consequences that aren't specific to diversity and inclusion. You're never going to be able to live up to your potential. You're never going to be able to live up to your potential in solving problems and being innovative if the people on your payroll are not comfortable telling the truth to each other. And you can find that pretty easily. You can find organizations that on all levels, they avoid serious disagreement at all consequences, right? And again, I would look at how you deal with conflict as being at the very center of this work of inclusion. So I think there's a number of different places you can look for kind of some important indicators.
So let's unpack that a little bit, because there's a bunch of stuff going on. I am always drawn to this idea that, how do you reinforce and clarify what's truly valued by your organization? We say that a lot as we talk about our own cultures, and putting diversity and inclusion up on a plaque that's going to show up in your break room is one thing that may be a quote unquote value. The question is it really valued? And does everything you used, actions, choices, behaviors? Can you start to give us some examples around what those actions, those choices, those behaviors might look, feel, sound like? I mean, I know it's different for every organization, but give us some context on that.
Yeah, well, I'll go back to I ended that kind of long rambling answer talking a little bit about conflict, and I see conflict as being really at the very center of this work of inclusion. One of the ways in which difference shows up between people is in disagreement. Not only is that natural, that's actually valuable. Disagreement done well is really, really valuable, but most organizations, because they don't actually value difference, they avoid serious disagreement at all costs. So I would say some of the actions and practices and decisions that I would look for is organizations that have an intentional, proactive relationship with conflict done well. They train people on it. They evaluate managers on it. They reward people when they do it well. When I talk about behaviors and actions and things like that around diversity and inclusion, people kind of have a hard time getting traction, but just look at a different body of work. Look at how we treat sales. We have specific outcomes that we're looking for. We have specific quotas. We reward people when they hit those quotas. If this stuff is really important, and these organizations, these leaders are saying that it is, then we should kind of treat it the exact same way. Specific outcomes, specific behaviors, specific consequences, good and bad. Are you, as an organization, when you make promotion decisions, is this an important part of it? Not just in regards to, is the person in our eyes that we're talking about promoting diverse, but are they inclusive? Have they exhibited inclusive behaviors? And again, this is where it's really important to get some clarity on what inclusion means for your organization, because if you get some clarity on that, if the inclusive employee experience is the end product, we should be able to explain it. We should be able to talk about its characteristics. What does it look like and feel like and sound like? And if we can do that to some extent, then we can identify the behaviors and practices that go into that experience. And then those become our expectations. We write them into job descriptions, we evaluate people on them, we coach them, we train them, we release them back out in the wild if they're not willing and able to act accordingly. And that's almost always missing today. There's just no consequences. As long as you say the right things, there's just no consequences for not being on board with this body of work.
What are you, so I think this clarity piece, like, it is so important. I mean, if you put this one word out there, which we know is huge, of inclusion, it means so many different things to so many different people. I really like the idea of making it, more palatable or more colorful, or there's context, there's emotion behind it. How do you see organizations do that? Like, what are they doing to create their own, maybe it's not their own definition, but their own version of what inclusion really means? How do they get that clarity? How do they go about doing that?
Well, they're not doing that right now.
They're not.
Their language and their logic just isn't clear, and that's one of the reasons why they have such a hard time getting traction. They're fighting a lot of battles that they shouldn't have to fight. You're probably familiar with the Heath brothers, Dan and Chip Heath. In one of their books, I think it's Switch, there's this wonderful line that's been just kind of carved into the inside of my skull since I read it. And they say in there that what looks like resistance is often a lack of clarity. And I think that's true, and I think it's incredibly true regarding this particular body of work. There is some real resistance to this work, but I think much more than that, we face a lack of clarity. There are people in the corporate world that when you say diversity and inclusion, what they hear is political correctness.
Yep.
What they hear is a liberal political agenda.
Yep.
What they hear is we ought to hire people of color because we feel sorry for them, right? They're not actually resistant to the work at hand. They're resistant to what they think the work is. And so I think having a common language in your organization is one of the most powerful tools at our disposal. And most organizations spend no time talking about language. They operate in the assumption that, of course, we all know what diversity and inclusion means. And we do, but none of that stuff is the same, right? We're using the same words, but we've all got a different idea in our head. That common language is part of how we get rid of some of that resistance and how we stop fighting battles that we really shouldn't need to be fighting. And I don't come at this with the perspective that there's a right definition or a wrong definition. They are big, complex topics, but what do they mean in your organization? When you say the word diversity, specifically, what do you mean and what do you not mean? When you say the word inclusion, what do you mean and what do you not mean? That just isn't there. And that's I've been doing more work in that space in the past year or two because I think it's so important and it's so critical. And even just in starting to do that work and in putting executives through some of those conversations, they just haven't thought about it. They're so quick to rattle off words like respect and tolerance, but even those are kind of vague, abstract concepts. How do those things show up in behavior? And until we get to the conversation about behavior and practice and policy, we're kind of just, we're kind of playing with sand. We can't build anything. We can't go anywhere.
So I love the reference from Dan and Chip Heath. I think that's awesome, and man, can apply to so many things about the workplace. I mean, we've been talking about this for what, I don't know, 20 years now, maybe longer. I mean, in a real way. I mean, you and I have not been talking about that long, but leadership, management, organizations have been talking about diversity and inclusion in some form or fashion for, let's call it a generation. And we're taking a little bit of a tangent here. Have things changed? Like, are you seeing momentum in a meaningful way, or are we churning and burning and spinning wheels as we always have? Maybe that's not the right question, but I'm just, given your point of view, I'd love to get your perspective on it.
I mean, I think both. And I think, part of the reality of where we're at today is that this is the work that you and I are talking about right now. pursuing, which I'll just kind of summarize a little bit sloppily as pursuing diversity and inclusion as opportunities for competitive advantage. This body of work really is in its infancy. In 1964, the Civil Rights Act was passed, and discrimination in hiring and promotion and compensation became illegal. And there was, all of a sudden there was an equal employment opportunity, and there was a whole bunch of training that came out of that, but it was all very compliance driven. It was about, this is the law, these are the rules, this is how you stay out of trouble. That's basically the entirety of what was done in the name of diversity inclusion in the 60s and in the 70s. In the 80s, it started to evolve a little bit, but it was really focused on how do we help women and people of color fit in more. It was really kind of a model of assimilation. In the 90s, we started to get a little bit into sensitivity, and I think that's also where a lot of programs started to kind of point at white men as the problem, and there was a lot of programs that were now focused on fixing white men. I think all of this stuff is connected, but the body of work that we're talking about right now is in its infancy. It's been around for a decade or two. And so it's going to be conceptually and linguistically underdeveloped. Management has been around for over a century, and we still aren't always on the same page with that. This is kind of a new body of work. It seems like it's been around forever because it's also just part of the human experience, right?
Mm-hmm.
This isn't something, you can go home and not talk about management. It's increasingly unlikely that you're going to go home. You might not be using the words diversity and inclusion, but we're talking about race, we're talking about gender, we're talking about identity all the time, and for good reason, because we still haven't really figured that stuff out. So I think there is still spinning wheels. I think sometimes it even feels like we're losing ground in some places, but we're definitely moving things in the right direction. There are more leaders and more organizations that are talking very seriously about this. There are more people doing this work and driving this work that aren't coming up in the HR space. So I continue to be very hopeful, and I think that the next year, the next 2 years, I think we're going to see some larger breakthroughs. The conversation about diversity in tech is not going away. It's only getting louder. The conversation about diversity in Hollywood is not going away. It's only getting louder. And I think one of the things that's really had an impact on this work is social media. And I don't always love social media because I see some downsides to it as well. But groups of people are supporting each other and coming together, and these conversations have really grown, I think, partially due to the impact of Twitter and Facebook and other tools.
I appreciate the first of all the kind of the history, which is interesting, and how we've talked and thought about and responded to these opportunities over the last 20 years, but also the optimism kind of in what lies ahead. To that end, and I'm going to risk going over our time limit here a little bit, but I want to ask you two more questions. The first, just to kind of get maybe a knee jerk. I've got a high schooler. I've got a junior high schooler. I know that they think about inclusion and diversity in a much different way than certainly I did growing up, just by virtue of how they are exposed to it, and I think how we're living it societally today. What kind of impact is the next generation going to have on how we think about this? Or will they fall prey to, once subjected to the traditional paradigms of work, the same kinds of traps?
Yeah, I think there's kind of an interesting thing there, because you hear a lot of folks say that things, in this particular body of work, things always get better with the next generation. And I've always kind of felt like, I don't know that they get better, but I know that they get different.
Mm-hmm.
I come from rural Northwest Iowa. Both of my parents come from rural Northwest Iowa, and they talk about, when they were growing up, it was a really big deal whether you were dating a Catholic or a Protestant. And today, that doesn't even show up as diversity. That wouldn't even qualify as religious diversity. That's almost the exact same thing. So, norms change. I can take a look at gender. Gender expectations and norms have changed in our lifetime drastically. if you just take a look at how women were portrayed on television when you and I were kids,
Right.
that's drastically different than it was today. And so on some of these things, they're going to be in a very different place. Gender is moved, orientation and gender identity in some ways are moving pretty quickly forward. They're going to have some different expectations, but the same human tendencies still lie underneath. And I think, while we're seeing some of those things become much more positive or much more well embraced, I think we're seeing increasing divisions around politics and some other issues. So I don't know. I think, it kind of depends. And I think part of it depends on how we continue to use these incredibly powerful tools that almost overnight have just become a natural part of our lives, that these kids have grown up with.
Right.
You and I didn't grow up with this stuff. We have a different relationship with it than they do. And so I think that's a big part of it. I think, Facebook is a good example, and I don't spend a lot of time on Facebook anymore, but even going back to news and fake news and truth and reality in the last election, there's a lot of interesting conversation around what happened on Facebook and what kind of obligation and responsibilities Facebook and Twitter have in policing the information that's shared there, the way that we interact there, because these tools can be used in very positive ways. They're almost ideally diversity and inclusion tools if they're used the correct way, but they can also be used the opposite way. So I think we've got some big decisions and some big conversations to have around some of that stuff as well. And I think, our kids growing up are going to be some of the people that figure some of that stuff out and make sense of it.
Joe, what's the one thing our audience can go back to their desks today with, and start to spark the conversation, to build some momentum, to focus on clarity and all of the things that you've alluded to today? Is there something that succinct that you would encourage people to really start doing?
It can be succinctly said. It's not really a succinct act, but I think it's so important to educate yourself on this stuff, to leave your comfort zone, to make sure that you have people that are different from you in your life. I think, if we take a look at issues, race is a pretty good example right now. When we've got all these conversations about race, but we're not having one conversation, we're kind of having two different conversations. It's still easy for a white person to grow up in this country without giving a lot of thought to race, theirs or the race of another. But when they enter those conversations today, they think they know as much about race as anybody does because they have one. But they haven't thought about race. They haven't had conversations with people of other races. They haven't been exposed to the research and the scholarship around race. I think the same thing is true around gender. Have people in your life, not just Facebook friends, but people that you really know, who are different from you, that you can have conversations with. I think we still kind of approach this work as being about having good intentions, and that's just not enough. This is an activist body of work. It's not about whether you get it. It's not about what you say. It's about what you intentionally, proactively, deliberately do to advocate for diversity and inclusion. And I think we all need to continue to educate ourselves about that stuff to be effective at doing it.
I think that's really smart. I think it's more than actionable. It's practical. It's realistic, and I think you've left something. I think you've left the audience with a lot of things that are really valuable about this conversation. Thanks for sharing it with us today, Joe. You speak, you write, you advise. Guys, if you want to get serious about this stuff, like if you want to start this conversation in a real and meaningful and actionable way, I don't think there's any person on this planet who's better to help you with that than Joe Gerstein. But tell everybody how they can get in touch with you, Joe, where they ought to be looking to connect with you and or just, get more of your good stuff.
You're too kind, Charlie Judy, and I love you dearly. Probably the easiest place to find me is my website, joegerstant.com. So that's JoeGerstant. and you can find me there, and you can connect to me on social media through there. And I do some writing and provide some video content and other stuff there.
Awesome. Well, thanks again for being with us today. It means a lot to me, and I know to the audience, and we will look to continue this conversation as we all should be. Signing off for now. Please feel free to download and share, and look out for next episodes here in the next couple weeks. Talk to you soon, guys.
If you enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe so you won't miss our regular programming. Forward-thinking organizations use WorkXO's culture-fueled people analytics to optimize their workforce. And they out-recruit, out-engage, and outperform their competition every single day. Learn more about our cloud-based culture management platform at www.workxo.com. Thanks again.